Good evening and welcome back here to World Talks on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Now, in just a few days, Ukraine has launched strikes on 3 major Russian ammunition depots, inflicting significant losses. Now, according to the British Ministry of Defense, these are the largest setbacks for Russian arms supplies since the start of the full-scale war. Now, at the same time, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has declared October as a decisive month, highlighting plans to coordinate with allies on the next steps of his victory plan, which he recently presented to the U.S. Now, to explore what this means for Ukraine's strategy and more, joining me now is Peter Doran, a Joint Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, good evening. Thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks on TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So, sir, now the U.S. President's administration, now following Zelenskyy's trip to America, I mean, he's met with Trump, with President Joe Biden, with Kamala Harris. The Wall Street Journal reported that they're actually disappointed with Zelenskyy's victory plan. Now, they accuse him of, among other things, having a lack of a clear vision. And the reality is that we don't really know the details of this plan, but what can you tell us about it?
Well, that's the point. Right now, Zelenskyy is returning to Ukraine after what I do believe is a successful visit to the United States. As you rightly pointed out, he came to Washington, he met with the president, President Biden, he met with VP Harris, and he also met with former President Trump, among others. In presenting his plan, he did not release it to the public, but we must assume the request to use long-range weapons by Ukraine, provided by the West, deep into Russia, that must be a critical component of that victory plan. I would highlight for your audience, though, this visit with President Trump was critical, and we saw positive developments coming out of that visit between former President Trump and President Zelenskyy. So now,
Ukraine continues launching strikes on Russian targets. This is obviously becoming a little bit of somewhat of a, if we can call this a humiliation for Russian President Vladimir Putin, that most likely wasn't expecting the outcome of the war to turn out like this. But does it give Ukraine a strategic advantage, and how? How is this changing the course of this conflict, and particularly now after Zelenskyy's trip to the States?
The ability to attack Russia's logistical supply lines, its radar systems, its oil, petroleum reserves, these are all absolutely essential targets. They're military targets that Ukraine has wanted to attack for quite some time. The Biden administration has, I believe, wrongly been too worried over its fears of escalation with Russia. The Biden administration has essentially been deterring itself in not allowing the Ukrainians to use these weapons to strike targets that the U.S. military would strike were we in a similar situation. So Zelenskyy clearly wants to have that authorization, and we know they can use these weapons effectively. And I would point out the difference between Ukraine and Russia. Russia attacks Ukrainian hospitals, civilian infrastructure, apartment buildings, and the Ukrainians have been very clear, we intend to only attack legitimate military targets. That is a absolutely necessary distinction between the two sides in this conflict.
So you mentioned definitely a lot of points there. There's so much we can tackle on this, but let me just take you back to Zelenskyy's visit for a moment here in the United States. The U.S. presented him that they would be supporting in the amount of around $8 billion US dollars. But let me ask you this. How concerned is Ukraine about the possibility of America's foreign policy changing towards Ukraine and possibly losing a lot of this, depending on who wins the next U.S. presidential elections?
Well, that was the goal of Zelenskyy's visit here to the United States. He wanted to make sure that whoever wins the upcoming presidential election, Trump or Harris, whoever the victor is, Ukraine will still maintain the support of the United States. And he got that victory. He is returning back to Ukraine now, knowing that if VP Harris wins, we're likely to see a broad continuation of the current policy. If Trump wins, he now has a rock solid pledge by former President Trump that the United States will support Ukraine. This was something he was not sure of prior to his arrival on this visit. So that is a major win for Zelenskyy. And frankly, I think it's a win for the United States as well.
Okay, you're saying rock solid edge, but what specific strategies do you think that Zelenskyy, Ukraine in general, is putting in place to ensure bipartisan support, no matter who wins these elections? I mean, particularly given the fact that he is keeping this victory plan very much on the hush to the public.
Well, when he met with President Trump afterwards, he shared some of his insight into how that meeting went. And I note from that conversation that Zelenskyy was keen to impress upon former President Trump that the conditions on the ground in Ukraine have changed since his last administration. And so perhaps President Trump believes that he can quickly negotiate a deal with Russia to end the fighting. And I believe Zelenskyy was trying to impress upon him that might not be possible unless we as Ukrainians can negotiate from a position of strength. And on the basis of that conversation, it does look like President Trump understood that and has pledged his support to Ukraine as a result.
Now, are there any specific conditions under which Ukraine would actually be willing to enter diplomatic negotiations with Russia? Is this, I mean, it's such a difficult question to answer, but how do you foresee this playing out?
Up until this point, we have seen Ukrainians say, no, we do not want to trade our land for peace. However, we must recognize that Ukrainians now hold parts of Russian territory. They hold Russian land. So if President Zelenskyy faces a tough political corner, if he faces the question, I can't trade my own land for peace, perhaps it might be possible for him to trade Russia's land for peace. So that's why this opening of this Kursk offensive, the taking of Russian land, is so key. And I think both President Trump and perhaps even President Putin see this as a negotiating chip that could be used in any final settlement.
Now, Zelenskyy's, of course, victory plan focused a lot on military success rather than negotiations with Russia, of course. Now, how do you think he can balance his military objectives simultaneously with these diplomatic talks? And again, since we're on the topic of negotiations, and of course, especially given the fact that, I mean, Russia still keeps striking Ukraine on a daily basis.
Well, President Zelenskyy has been absolutely clear. We cannot negotiate from a position of military weakness. If we are going to have a successful negotiated end to the fighting, Ukraine must be negotiating from a position of strength. That requires victory on the battlefield. That requires hitting Russian military targets deep behind the front lines, making it harder and harder for Russia to feed its war machine inside Ukraine. These are all priorities that Ukraine must achieve if it is going to negotiate from a position of strength. And I get the very strong impression that President Trump seemed to have received that message and again pledged his support to President Zelenskyy as a result.
So what role, like following the UN General Assembly, what role do you think that the UN can play in possibly finding a solution to this conflict, particularly with the new American elections coming up and this shift? I mean, of course, we all heard Zelenskyy's address at the UN. What role could the UN play?
Well, I hate to be the skunk at the garden party on this question, but frankly, I don't think the United Nations has a very significant role to play, mainly because Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has a veto over any resolutions that would come from the United Nations. We've also seen that the United Nations has been unable to use its weight and its powers of persuasion to encourage Russia to stop fighting in Ukraine, to cease its brutal war. So I really would minimize the role of the United Nations and look more actively at the United States as a mediator, along with the European Union, in finding some end to this fighting. This is certainly going to be the priority of the next Trump administration. And if it's Vice President Harris, should she win, you're also going to see an emphasis on working with allies in Europe and less of an emphasis on the United Nations, simply because it doesn't carry much weight with the Russians.
Sir, let me ask you very briefly now, just to shift gears here, and less on the political side, and specifically on the humanitarian aspect. I want to know what you can tell me about the mood in Ukraine by ordinary Ukrainian citizens concerning the war. I mean, I'm sure people are just very tired. Winter is coming up. What does it look like? I mean, I've seen some videos, of course, of many, officers, taking away, we've seen them on Telegram, taking away, of course, Ukrainians on the streets, particularly to most likely take them into the army. But what is the actual mood present day?
Well, you're seeing two powerful trends. First, resolve, the spirit of resolve that we are going to get through this. We are going to defend our country. We're going to make those sacrifices worth something. That remains very strong in Ukraine. You see it in the polling numbers. You see it in all sorts of anecdotal examples. But you also are seeing some question whether or not it might be possible, for example, to negotiate an end to the fighting, even if that meant giving up some land either permanently or temporarily.
Thank you so much for your input, Sir Peter Doran, adjunct senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, for your insight. Thank you for being with us here on World Talks on TVP World. And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Stay tuned for more news up next.